They adopted a rescue dog, but he kept digging up antique jewelry stolen in a 70-year-old. Adopting a dog isn't going to bring him back, she'd said flatly when Lila first suggested it over coffee one dreary Tuesday morning. But Lila, ever persistent, wouldn't let it go. It's not about replacing anyone, Maggie. You're lonely, and you've always loved animals. Reluctantly, Maggie gave in, not because she believed Lila was right, but because arguing with her felt like trying to stop a hurricane with an umbrella. So last Saturday, she found herself standing inside the local animal shelter, staring at rows of hopeful eyes peering out from behind metal bars. That's where she met Charlie. He wasn't particularly handsome, nor did he have the eager-to-please demeanor most people looked for in a pet. His fur was patchy, his ears mismatched, one floppy, one upright, and there was something oddly knowing in the way he tilted his head as if sizing her up. The shelter staff called him quirky and clever. They also admitted they knew next to nothing about his background. He'd simply shown up one day, wandering along the edge of town, no collar, no microchip, no owner claiming him. Against all odds, or perhaps because of them, Maggie signed the adoption papers. At first, Charlie seemed perfectly ordinary. He ate voraciously, napped loudly, and occasionally barked at squirrels daring enough to cross into the backyard. But by the end of the second week, things changed. One evening, as Maggie prepared dinner, she noticed the screen door hanging ajar. Stepping outside, she called for Charlie, only to find him trotting out of the woods behind the house, his mouth clamped firmly around what appeared to be a piece of jewelry. "What on earth?" she muttered, kneeling down as he dropped the object at her feet. It was an antique brooch, its delicate filigree tarnished but still beautiful. Etched into the back were the initials EM and the date 1923. "Where did you get this?" she asked, though Charlie merely wagged his tail and ambled toward the water dish on the porch. Over the next few days, the disappearances became more frequent. Each time Charlie returned, he brought another relic, a tarnished locket engraved with R.A. Forever, a brass pocket watch stopped at 317, and finally a diamond ring nestled in a bed of moss. Maggie stared at the ring, turning it over in her hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the stone glittering faintly even in the dim light of the kitchen. She couldn't shake the feeling that these items weren't random. They were clues, fragments of someone else's story buried deep in the past. Her curiosity outweighed her unease and she began researching. Late nights stretched into early mornings as she scoured online archives, old newspaper articles, and genealogy records. The brooch led her to Eleanor Mayfield, a woman who'd lived in the area during the 1920s and disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The locket bore names linked to a family feud chronicled in grainy, black and white photographs. And the ring? Its provenance remained elusive, but the setting hinted at wealth and tragedy. As Maggie pieced together the puzzle, questions multiplied. How had Charlie found these objects? Why now? And why here in the woods surrounding her home, a property she'd inherited from Arthur's parents decades ago? One thing was certain. Whatever secrets lay hidden in those trees, Charlie was determined to unearth them. Whether Maggie wanted to follow him down that path remained to be seen, but ignoring the growing mystery felt impossible. After all, life without Arthur had left her adrift, searching for meaning in quiet moments. Perhaps Charlie, quirky and clever as he was, had arrived not just to fill the silence, but to guide her toward answers neither of them could anticipate. For now, she resolved to keep digging. Whatever truths awaited in the shadows of the forest, she would face them, for Arthur, for herself, and maybe, just maybe, for Charlie too. Maggie hesitated outside the door of Elliot's Antiques Appraisals, clutching the small velvet pouch containing the brooch, locket, and ring. She'd debated for days whether bringing these strange artifacts to an expert was a good idea. What if they were tied to something illegal? Or worse, what if they belonged to someone who still cared about them? But curiosity had won out over caution. Inside, the shop smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. Behind the counter stood Mr. Elliot himself, a wiry man in his late 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses perched on the end of his nose and a magnifying loupe dangling from a chain around his neck. He greeted Maggie with a polite nod before gesturing for her to place the items on the glass display case. Found these? He asked, adjusting his glasses as she carefully laid out the treasures. His tone was casual, but there was a glimmer of intrigue in his eyes. In a way, Maggie replied vaguely, I'm hoping you can tell me more about them. Mr. Elliot picked up the brooch first, examining it under the bright desk lamp. His brow furrowed as he turned it over, inspecting the engraved initials and date. Then came the locket, which he opened with surprising delicacy, revealing faded photographs inside. Finally, he held the diamond ring up to the light, squinting through his loupe. These are remarkable pieces, he said after a long pause, and very familiar. Maggie leaned forward. Familiar how? He set the ring down gently and pulled a thick ledger from beneath the counter. Flipping through yellowed pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches, he stopped at an entry dated 1952. Beneath the heading, Notable Thefts, a grainy photograph showed a collection of jewelry spread across a velvet cloth. The brooch, the locket, and even the ring unmistakably among them. This lot was stolen during one of the most infamous burglaries in this county's history, Mr. Elliot explained. A wealthy family named the Hargroves had their estate ransacked while they were away on vacation. Most of the stolen goods were never recovered. People assumed they'd been smuggled out of town or melted down for scrap. Maggie's pulse quickened. So, these items have been missing for nearly 70 years? That's right. Mr. Elliot studied her face intently. Where did you say you found them again? I didn't, Maggie replied quickly, tucking jewelry back into the pouch. Thank you for your help. As she left the shop, her mind raced. If Charlie had unearthed remnants of such a high-profile crime, what did that mean? Had someone buried them deliberately? Or had they simply been forgotten, left to decay in the woods behind her house? Either way, the discovery felt significant and dangerous. Back home, Maggie poured herself another cup of tea and spread out photocopies of newspaper clippings she'd printed from the library's archives. The burglary had dominated headlines for weeks, with speculation running rampant about who might be responsible. Some accused vagrants passing through town. Others pointed fingers at disgruntled servants. One theory suggested the thief had been someone close to the Hargrove family, using insider knowledge to pull off the heist. But none of the theories panned out. Eventually, interest waned, and the case slipped into obscurity. Until now, her gaze drifted to the window, where Charlie lounged on the porch, gnawing contentedly on a bone. How had he known where to find those items? Was it pure coincidence, or was there something more to his behavior? She decided to test him. That evening, armed with a flashlight and wearing sturdy boots, Maggie followed Charlie into the woods. He trotted ahead confidently, weaving between trees and occasionally glancing back to ensure she was keeping up. After 20 minutes, he stopped near a cluster of rocks partially obscured by ivy. Maggie crouched beside him, brushing away leaves and dirt until her fingers brushed against something hard. Her heart pounded as she uncovered a rusted tin box half buried in the earth. Inside were more trinkets, a silver cigarette case, a strand of pearls, and several other pieces that matched descriptions from the stolen Hargrove collection. For a moment, she sat there stunned, the weight of what she'd stumbled upon sinking in. This wasn't just a random discovery. It was evidence of a decades-old crime that no one had solved. And Charlie? He barked once, then bounded off deeper into the woods, leaving Maggie alone with the box and a growing sense of unease. What else was hidden out here? And who else might be watching? Maggie didn't mean to let it slip. She'd stopped by Lila's house one afternoon, intending only to borrow a casserole dish. But somehow the conversation turned to Charlie and his peculiar habit of bringing home relics from the woods. He brought back another piece this morning, Maggie admitted, pulling the tarnished cigarette case from her purse. It's part of that stolen Hargrove collection. Lila's eyes widened. You're kidding. How is that even possible? I don't know, Maggie said with a sigh. But I followed him into the woods last night, and there's more out there. Boxes of it. It's like someone stashed everything and then forgot about it. Word traveled fast in their small town. By the next day, whispers of Maggie's discovery had reached the ears of curious neighbors. Some dismissed it as an oddity, while others couldn't resist speculating about its connection to the old scandal. That's when Eleanor Whitmore's name came up. Eleanor Whitmore, or Miss Ellie, as the older residents affectionately called her, was something of a local legend. Once the daughter of Charles Whitmore, the wealthiest man in town, she had lived through the Hargrove burglary as a teenager. The scandal had shattered her family. Charles was accused of orchestrating the theft, though no concrete evidence ever surfaced to convict him. The accusations drove him to ruin, and the once grand Whitmore estate fell into disrepair. Curiosity gnawed at Maggie. If anyone might shed light on the mystery, it was Eleanor. But approaching her felt daunting. What if she thought Maggie was prying? Or worse, what if she refused to talk at all? Still, Maggie decided to try. The Whitmore property sat at the edge of town, its crumbling mansion surrounded by overgrown gardens and sagging fences. Maggie parked her car along the gravel driveway and approached the front porch, where Eleanor sat in a wicker chair, knitting what appeared to be a scarf. Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and her sharp blue eyes studied Maggie as she climbed the steps. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Maggie began hesitantly. "It's Miss Whitmore," Eleanor corrected, her voice steady but warm. "And you must be Margaret. Your late husband's parents used to own the land bordering ours, didn't they?" "Yes, that's right," Maggie replied, surprised by Eleanor's memory. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to ask—" "You've heard the stories," Eleanor interrupted, setting her knitting aside, "about my father and the Hargroves." Maggie nodded. "Something unusual has happened recently. My dog, Charlie, he's been finding items in the woods behind my house, pieces from the stolen collection." Eleanor's expression softened, tinged with sadness. "Ah, so it's come to that." She gestured for Maggie to sit beside her. "Tell me everything." Over the course of an hour, Eleanor shared fragments of her past. She spoke of growing up in the shadow of wealth and privilege, of watching her father struggle under the weight of suspicion after the burglary. Though he maintained his innocence until his death, rumors persisted, poisoning relationships and driving the family into isolation. "There were whispers," Eleanor said quietly, "that someone close to the Hargroves betrayed them. A trusted friend or employee who knew the layout of the house, the safe combinations. But nothing was ever proven," Maggie prompted. "No," Eleanor agreed. "And perhaps that's why these things are resurfacing now. Secrets have a way of refusing to stay buried forever." As Maggie left the Whitmore estate later that afternoon, her mind swirled with new questions. If Charles Whitmore hadn't acted alone, and possibly hadn't acted at all, who else could have been involved? And why would they hide the stolen goods so close to home, practically within sight of the victims themselves? Back at her house, Charlie greeted her enthusiastically, wagging his tail and nudging her hand with his nose. Maggie knelt to scratch behind his ears, marveling at the strange role fate had thrust upon him. "Are you helping me solve a 70-year-old mystery, boy?" she murmured. Charlie barked once as if in agreement. Whatever answers lay hidden in the woods, and in the memories of those who remembered the scandal, they were closer than ever. But uncovering the truth would require courage, patience, and perhaps a willingness to confront ghosts better left undisturbed. Maggie spent the evening after her visit with Eleanor, digging through boxes in the attic, searching for anything that might connect Arthur to the Whitmores or the decades-old scandal. She hadn't intended to delve so deeply into their shared history. After all, Arthur had rarely spoken of his childhood, but something about Eleanor's words lingered in her mind. Secrets refusing to stay buried. Ghosts better left undisturbed. The attic smelled faintly of cedar and dust, its air thick with memories. Maggie pulled down an old shoebox labeled "Photos" in Arthur's neat handwriting and began sorting through its contents. Most of the photographs were familiar. Snapshots of family vacations, holidays with Lila and her husband Tom, candid moments captured over years of quiet contentment. But near the bottom of the box, she found one that stopped her cold. It was a faded Polaroid, its edges curled slightly with age. In it, a young Arthur stood outside the grand but weathered facade of the Whitmore estate, his hands shoved casually into the pockets of bell-bottom jeans. Behind him loomed the mansion's imposing columns, ivy creeping up the brick walls like nature reclaiming its own. What struck Maggie most, however, wasn't the setting. It was the note scrawled on the back in Arthur's unmistakable script. "Always remember what lies beneath." Her breath caught. What did it mean? And why would Arthur have been at the Whitmore estate in the first place? Growing up, he'd always described his upbringing as unremarkable, his parents as ordinary folks who worked hard and kept to themselves. Yet here was proof that he'd known far more about the town's most infamous family than he'd ever let on. Maggie sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the photograph as if it might reveal answers if she willed it hard enough. The phrase "what lies beneath" echoed in her thoughts, conjuring images of hidden treasures or buried sins. Was this some cryptic reference to the stolen Hargrove collection? Or was there something else entirely that Arthur had wanted her to remember? She felt a pang of guilt for not knowing, for having accepted his silence without question. Had he meant to tell her someday? Or had he hoped she'd never find out? That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, the photograph resting on her bedside table, its cryptic message taunting her. By morning, she'd resolved to dig deeper, not just into the mystery of the stolen goods, but into Arthur's past as well. If he'd kept secrets, she owed it to him and to herself to understand why. Her first stop was the local library, where she pored over microfiche records from the early 1970s. It didn't take long to uncover a series of articles detailing efforts to restore the Whitmore estate. Apparently, a group of volunteers had rallied around Eleanor, then in her 30s, to salvage what remained of the once magnificent property. Among the names listed as contributors was Arthur's father, Robert Caldwell. Maggie stared at the name, her chest tightening. So Arthur's connection to the Whitmores wasn't random, it was familial. His father had been involved in preserving their legacy, even as whispers of Charles Whitmore's guilt continued to circulate. But why hadn't Arthur mentioned any of this? Why keep it hidden for so many years? When she returned home, Charlie greeted her eagerly, wagging his tail and nudging her hand with his nose. For a moment, she envied his simplicity, the way he lived fully in the present, unburdened by the weight of secrets or regrets. "I wish you could talk," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Maybe you'd tell me what Arthur couldn't." Charlie barked once as if in agreement, before trotting toward the door leading to the backyard. Maggie followed him absently, her mind still swirling with questions. As they stepped onto the porch, she froze. In the distance, beyond the trees where Charlie had unearthed the first relics, sunlight glinted off something metallic half buried in the dirt. Maggie's pulse quickened as she approached, brushing away leaves and soil until she uncovered another object. A rusted key attached to a tarnished brass tag engraved with the initials C.W. Charles Whitmore. Maggie held the key in trembling fingers, its significance undeniable. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the woods, whatever truths Arthur had tried to protect her from, they were closer than ever. And now, thanks to Charlie's relentless curiosity, and perhaps fate itself, she was determined to uncover them, for Arthur, for Eleanor, and for the truth that refused to stay buried. The woods behind Maggie's house had always been a quiet refuge, a place where sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams, and the only sounds were birdsong and rustling leaves. But as Maggie followed Charlie deeper into the trees that evening, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows stretched longer, the air grew cooler, and an eerie stillness settled over the forest. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Charlie moved with purpose, his tail low but steady, weaving between gnarled roots and moss-covered rocks. Maggie clutched the flashlight tightly, its beam cutting through the gathering dusk. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, a hidden stash of more stolen goods, perhaps, or some clue that would finally explain how Charlie kept uncovering these artifacts. But nothing could have prepared her for what lay ahead. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, Charlie stopped at the edge of an overgrown clearing. The ground here was uneven, dotted with patches of wildflowers and thick ivy that seemed to swallow everything in its path. At first glance, it looked like any other forgotten corner of the woods. But then Maggie noticed the faint outline of something beneath the greenery. A slanted roof, partially collapsed, with splintered wooden planks peeking through the vines. It was the ruins of an old shed. Her heart pounded as she knelt beside the structure, pulling away handfuls of ivy and debris. Beneath the decay, the shed revealed itself, small and unassuming, its walls warped with age and moisture. A jagged hole yawned where the door once stood, inviting her inside despite the chill it sent down her spine. "Charlie," she whispered, glancing at the dog who sat patiently nearby, his ears pricked forward. "What on earth are you showing me?" Taking a deep breath, Maggie stepped inside. The interior smelled of damp wood and mildew, the floor littered with broken glass and rotting timbers. Her flashlight swept across the space, illuminating fragments of forgotten life. Shards of pottery, rusted tools, and, most strikingly, a tin box tucked into the far corner. The box was dented and streaked with corrosion, but it opened easily enough when Maggie pried at the lid. Inside, nestled among crumpled newspaper clippings and scraps of fabric, were more pieces of jewelry: a pearl bracelet, a gold pocket watch, a pair of diamond earrings, all unmistakably part of the Hargrove collection. But it wasn't just the jewelry that caught her attention. Beneath the glittering trinkets lay fragments of letters, their ink faded but legible in places. One piece bore the words, "My dearest Ellie," while another read, "I can't keep this secret much longer." Maggie's hands trembled as she pieced together the torn paper. The letters were addressed to someone named Ellie, Eleanor Whitmore. Back home, Maggie spread the fragments across her kitchen table, carefully aligning them like pieces of a puzzle. Some sections were missing entirely, leaving gaps in the narrative, but enough remained to paint a haunting picture. The author of the letters, whose name was never mentioned, spoke of guilt and fear, of a betrayal too heavy to bear. They referenced the theft of the Hargrove jewels, hinting at complicity without outright confessing. One line stood out starkly. "If anyone discovers what we've done, neither of us will survive it." Maggie stared at the words, her mind racing. Who had written these letters, and why had they hidden them alongside the stolen jewelry in this remote shed? Was it possible that Eleanor herself had been involved, or had someone else tried to implicate her family further? Her thoughts turned to Arthur again, to the cryptic note on the back of the photograph and the key engraved with Charles Whitmore's initials. Had he known about this place? About the letters? Charlie padded into the room, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor. He paused beside her chair, gazing up at her with those knowing eyes. "You've led me to something big, haven't you?" Maggie murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Something that's been buried for decades." Whether it was coincidence or fate, Charlie had unlocked a door to the past, one that refused to stay closed. And now, with each new discovery, Maggie felt herself being pulled further into a web of secrets that spanned generations. She didn't know yet whether she was ready to face the truth, but one thing was certain. The answers lay somewhere in the shadows of the forest, waiting for her to uncover them. The next morning, Maggie sat across from Eleanor Whitmore in her modest sitting room, the air thick with tension. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn rug beneath their feet. On the table between them rested the tarnished locket Maggie had brought along, a piece engraved with the initials EW that she hoped would jog Eleanor's memory. "I don't know what you expect me to tell you," Eleanor said stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "That jewelry has nothing to do with me." Maggie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Miss Whitmore, I understand this is difficult, but Charlie, my dog, he keeps finding these items in the woods behind my house. And when I found those letters—" She paused, watching as Eleanor's expression flickered with something unreadable. "I think there's more to this story than anyone knows. Maybe even more than your father was accused of." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Her gaze dropped to the locket, and Maggie could see the weight of recognition settle over her. Finally, she reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced the engraved initials. "This belonged to my mother," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "And before her, my grandmother. It was part of a set passed down through our family for generations." Maggie leaned forward slightly. "Did it disappear during the burglary?" Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, along with everything else. The Hargrove jewels, the pieces stolen from our own collection, they all vanished within days of each other. My father was arrested not long after, though they never proved he took them. Her voice cracked, and she looked away, staring out the window at the overgrown gardens beyond. He swore he didn't do it, said someone close to us betrayed the family, but he wouldn't say who. He died believing the truth would come out eventually. And now? Maggie pressed gently. Do you think whoever took the jewelry might still be alive? Eleanor's shoulders sagged under the weight of years spent carrying unanswered questions. I've thought about it often, she admitted. Whoever it was must have been careful, clever enough to avoid suspicion while framing my father. If they're still alive, she trailed off, shaking her head. They've lived with this secret for decades. That kind of guilt doesn't just disappear. As the conversation unfolded, Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. The web of deceit was far larger and closer to home than she'd imagined. Whoever had orchestrated the theft hadn't merely robbed the Hargroves or the Whitmores. They had shattered lives, tearing apart families and leaving scars that spanned generations. What about the shed in the woods? Maggie asked finally. Do you know anything about it? Eleanor frowned, clearly confused. A shed? No, I can't say I do. We used to store tools and supplies in a small building near the property line back then, but it burned down years ago. Why do you ask? Maggie hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Charlie led me to an old structure buried under ivy. There were more pieces of jewelry inside, along with fragments of letters addressed to you. Eleanor's face paled. Letters? To me? Maggie nodded, pulling out photocopies of the torn pages she'd pieced together. As Eleanor read the fragmented lines, her hands began to shake. These aren't from my father, she murmured, her voice hollow. This handwriting. It's familiar, but it's not his. Then who wrote them? Maggie asked softly. Eleanor closed her eyes, her lips moving silently as if searching for a name. When she opened them again, there was a mixture of fear and resolve in her gaze. There's only one person it could be, she said quietly. Someone who knew every detail of our lives, who had access to everything, including the jewelry. She turned to Maggie, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You need to speak to Marjorie Trenton. She worked for us as a housekeeper during those years. After the scandal broke, she left town without a word. But rumor has it she returned years later, living quietly under an assumed name. By the time Maggie left Eleanor's house, her mind was reeling. Marjorie Trenton, a name whispered like a ghost haunting the edges of the past. If Eleanor was right, if Marjorie had played a role in the theft, then the answers Maggie sought might be closer than she realized. Outside, Charlie greeted her with a wag of his tail, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing in her thoughts. As they drove home, Maggie couldn't shake the image of Eleanor clutching the locket, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. Whoever Marjorie Trenton was, wherever she might be hiding, Maggie knew one thing for certain. The truth was no longer buried deep enough to stay hidden. And Charlie, ever the guide, seemed ready to lead her straight to it. The revelation about Marjorie Trenton lingered in Maggie's mind like an unanswered question. But it wasn't until she returned to the attic later that evening that another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Among the boxes she'd hastily searched earlier was one labeled Arthur's Papers, its contents untouched since his passing. Something inside her, a mix of curiosity and unease, urged her to open it now. Inside, she found a jumble of old notebooks, receipts, and faded photographs. But tucked beneath a stack of yellowed documents was a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn from years of use. The handwriting on the first page confirmed it belonged to Arthur. Maggie sank onto the floor, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. Most entries were mundane, notes about gardening projects, weather patterns, or weekend trips with friends. But near the back, dated late spring of 1972, she found something that made her heart stop. Worked at the Whitmore estate today. Eleanor seems kind enough, though distant. Mr. Whitmore barely speaks to anyone these days. Not surprising given the rumors still swirling around him. Found something odd near the old shed by the south fence line. The entry ended abruptly, leaving Maggie desperate for more context. She turned the page, scanning hastily scribbled notes that followed over the next few weeks. Spent hours clearing ivy off the shed. Noticed loose boards along the base. Inside, I saw signs someone had been there recently. Footprints in the dirt, scraps of fabric caught on nails. Didn't tell anyone what I found. Not sure why. And then two sentences that sent chills down her spine. Whatever happened here decades ago isn't finished yet. Secrets don't stay buried forever. They find ways to resurface when you least expect it. The final entry was brief but haunting. Decided not to dig deeper. Some truths are better left alone. Always remember what lies beneath. Maggie sat back, clutching the journal to her chest as tears blurred her vision. Arthur hadn't just known about the Whitmore estate. He'd worked there, tending to the grounds during a time when the family was still reeling from scandal, and somehow he'd stumbled upon evidence linking the theft to the very shed Charlie had led her to all these years later. But instead of exposing what he'd discovered, he'd chosen silence. Why? Her thoughts raced as she pieced together the implications. Had Arthur feared for their safety if he revealed too much? Or had he believed the truth would only cause pain without resolution? Whatever his reasons, his cryptic note suddenly took on new meaning. Always remember what lies beneath wasn't just a vague sentiment. It was a warning. A plea to tread carefully when uncovering the past. The next morning, armed with fresh determination, Maggie decided to visit the town historian, hoping to learn more about Arthur's time at the Whitmore estate. The historian, a spry octogenarian named Edith, greeted her warmly and listened intently as Maggie explained her findings. "Ah, yes, your husband did work there for a short while," Edith recalled after rifling through dusty records. "He was hired to help restore the gardens after Charles Whitmore passed away. Folks said he was quiet, kept to himself, but he seemed genuinely interested in helping Eleanor hold onto the property." Edith paused, her expression thoughtful. "You know, I always wondered why he left so suddenly, just packed up and moved on without saying much. People whispered it had something to do with the old scandal, but no one could prove anything." Maggie nodded slowly, her mind spinning. It seemed clear now. Arthur had uncovered something significant during his time at the estate, something tied to the theft and perhaps even to Eleanor herself. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or love, he kept it hidden, carrying the burden silently throughout their marriage. As she drove home, Charlie sitting beside her in the passenger seat, Maggie felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Sadness for the secrets Arthur had carried alone. Gratitude for the life they'd shared despite the shadows of the past. And resolve, an unshakable determination to bring closure to the mystery that had shaped so many lives. Charlie barked once, breaking her reverie, and Maggie smiled faintly. "Don't worry, boy," she murmured. "We're going to finish what Arthur started, because some secrets weren't meant to stay buried, and others deserve to see the light of day." Maggie stood in her living room, surveying the preparations for the neighborhood gathering with a mix of pride and nervous energy. She had spent days planning the event, a casual celebration of the town's history, complete with vintage photographs, artifacts from local families, and homemade refreshments. It wasn't just an excuse to bring people together. It was a carefully orchestrated opportunity to uncover more about the decades-old mystery haunting their community. The centerpiece of the display was a glass case borrowed from the library, filled with faded photographs and documents chronicling the Whitmore family's rise and fall. Eleanor had generously contributed several items from her own collection, including portraits of her parents and candid shots of the estate in its heyday. Maggie hoped that among these relics, someone might recognize something, or someone, that could shed light on the truth. As guests began arriving, the house buzzed with conversation. Longtime residents mingled over lemonade and cookies, reminiscing about shared memories and swapping stories about the Whitmores. Eleanor, seated near the display case, held court quietly, answering questions with grace but avoiding any mention of the scandal that had defined her youth. Charlie, sensing the excitement, or perhaps just enjoying the extra attention, wove through the crowd, wagging his tail and accepting pats on the head. Maggie kept one eye on him as she circulated among the guests, thanking them for coming and encouraging them to explore the exhibits. It happened without warning. One moment, Charlie was lounging contentedly by the fireplace. In the next, He bolted toward the display case like a streak of lightning. Before anyone could react, he leapt up, knocking into the side of the heavy glass enclosure with surprising force. The impact sent the entire structure wobbling precariously before it toppled onto the floor with a loud crash. Gas erupted around the room as shards of glass scattered across the carpet. Maggie rushed forward, heart pounding, ready to scold Charlie, but what she saw stopped her short. Behind the shattered remains of the display case, embedded into the wall itself, was a narrow rectangular outline, almost invisible beneath layers of paint and plaster. Someone had concealed a hidden compartment there, cleverly camouflaged until now. "What is this?" Lila asked, crouching beside Maggie to inspect the discovery. "I don't know," Maggie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to open it." With trembling hands, she used a butter knife from the refreshment table to pry at the edges of the panel. After several tense moments, the compartment popped free, revealing a small leather-bound journal tucked inside. Its cover bore the initials CW in faded gold lettering, Charles Whitmore's journal. The room fell silent as Maggie turned the book over in her hands, its significance sinking in. Eleanor's face went pale as she rose unsteadily from her chair, leaning on her cane for support. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "In the wall," Maggie said gently, holding it out toward her. "I think it belongs to you." Eleanor hesitated, then took the journal with reverent care. Her fingers traced the embossed initials as tears welled in her eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with a deep breath, Eleanor opened the journal and began to read aloud. The entries were dated shortly after the infamous burglary. Charles Whitmore's handwriting was precise but strained, betraying the weight of the accusations leveled against him. In meticulous detail, he recounted the events leading up to the theft. Not as the mastermind, but as a man who believed he'd been framed. According to the journal, Marjorie Trenton, the trusted housekeeper, had approached Charles weeks before the crime, claiming she needed money to care for her ailing mother. At first, Charles dismissed her pleas, believing her to be exaggerating her plight. But later, when the stolen goods disappeared, he realized she must have taken advantage of her position within the household to orchestrate the theft. "She knew every inch of this property," Eleanor murmured, interrupting her reading. "Every hiding place, every secret passage." The final entry was particularly chilling. "Marjorie came to me today demanding hush money in exchange for keeping quiet about my supposed involvement. I refused. She left in anger, vowing I would regret crossing her. If anything happens to me, or if the truth comes out, I want the world to know I am innocent." A stunned silence followed Eleanor's words. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for everyone in the room. Marjorie Trenton, the woman who had vanished after the scandal only to return years later under an assumed name, was not merely complicit in the theft. She was likely the mastermind behind it all. Maggie exchanged a glance with Eleanor, who looked both devastated and relieved, as if a burden she'd carried for decades had finally lifted. "We need to find her," Maggie said firmly. "She owes us the truth." Eleanor nodded, gripping the journal tightly. "And maybe, just maybe, we can finally lay this ghost to rest." In the corner of the room, Charlie wagged his tail triumphantly, as if aware of the role he'd played in unraveling the mystery. Whatever secrets Marjorie Trenton had buried so deeply, they were about to come to light, and the town would never be the same again. As Eleanor continued reading aloud from Charles Whitmore's journal, the atmosphere in Maggie's living room grew heavier, charged with a mix of disbelief and dawning comprehension. The entries painted a picture far more complex and sinister than anyone could have imagined. Charles described how shortly after the theft, he was approached not only by Marjorie Trenton but also by another prominent figure in town, Reginald Becker, Harold Becker's grandfather. According to the journal, Reginald had discovered Marjorie's involvement in the burglary and used it as leverage against her. Instead of exposing her outright, however, he forced her to frame Charles Whitmore for the crime, ensuring that suspicion would fall squarely on the already disgraced family. Reginald's motive? Revenge. Decades earlier, Charles had outbid him for a lucrative business deal, humiliating him publicly and sparking a feud between their families. Framing the Whitmores for the theft was his way of settling the score. The most damning passage came near the end of the journal. "Reginald threatened me today, saying he'd ruin what little remained of my reputation if I dared speak out. He knows I'm innocent, just as he knows who truly orchestrated the theft. But he doesn't care. He only wants to see us destroyed. If anyone finds this journal, know the truth. I am not guilty. The real culprits are those who hid behind lies and power. Eleanor's voice cracked as she finished reading, her hands trembling around the worn pages. She looked up at the gathered crowd, her eyes glistening with tears. All these years, my father carried this secret alone. He died believing no one would ever believe him. Murmurs rippled through the room as people processed the revelation. Among them stood Harold Becker, his weathered face pale beneath its perpetual scowl. Maggie noticed him hovering near the back of the group, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as though bracing himself against an incoming storm. Maggie stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Harold's. "You knew," she said quietly, her tone steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Didn't you?" Harold stiffened, his jaw tightening. For a moment he seemed ready to deny everything, but then his shoulders sagged under the weight of collective stares. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "I found the letters when I was clearing out my grandfather's things," he admitted gruffly, avoiding eye contact. "He wrote about what he did, how he manipulated Marjorie into framing the Whitmores. At first I thought it was nonsense, but the more I read," his voice trailed off, thick with shame, "I didn't want anyone to know. Not because I agreed with him, but because," he hesitated, swallowing hard, "because I didn't want to tarnish our family name." Eleanor rose unsteadily from her chair, leaning heavily on her cane. Her expression was unreadable as she faced Harold, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You let my father take the blame," she said, her words sharp yet trembling. "You let him die carrying the guilt of something he didn't do. And all for what? To protect your precious legacy?" Harold flinched, looking away. "I wasn't proud of it," he muttered. "But what could I do? Dragging it up again wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring your father back." "No," Eleanor agreed, her voice softening slightly. "It wouldn't. But it might give us some peace." The room fell silent once more, the weight of the confession hanging over everyone present. Maggie glanced at Charlie, who sat nearby, his tail thumping gently against the floor as if sensing the emotional shift in the air. Without realizing it, she smiled faintly, a small acknowledgement of the role he'd played in bringing the truth to light. Lila broke the silence, her practical nature asserting itself. "What happens now?" she asked, glancing between Maggie, Eleanor, and Harold. "Do we go to the authorities? Try to clear Charles Whitmore's name officially?" Eleanor shook her head, slowly. "There's no proof strong enough to overturn history," she said. "And besides, I don't think my father would have wanted that. What matters is that we know the truth, and that we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Harold cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll talk to the Historical Society," he offered haltingly. "Make sure they update their records. Maybe even donate some of my grandfather's papers, including the ones I found. Let people decide for themselves what kind of man he really was." It wasn't much, but it was a start, a gesture toward accountability after decades of silence. Later that evening, as the guests began to disperse, Eleanor lingered behind, clutching the journal to her chest. She turned to Maggie, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Maggie smiled, brushing aside a stray tear. "We couldn't have done it without Charlie." At the mention of his name, Charlie trotted over, wagging his tail enthusiastically. Eleanor knelt stiffly, scratching him behind the ears. "You're quite the detective, aren't you?" she murmured, her voice warm with affection. As Maggie watched Eleanor leave, the journal tucked safely under her arm, she felt a strange sense of closure, not just for Eleanor or Arthur, but for herself. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always found a way to resurface. And sometimes all it took was a curious dog and a determined heart to unearth the truth. In the quiet aftermath, Maggie realized something else. Life had a way of weaving connections across generations, binding people together through shared stories and struggles. And while the scars of the past might never fully heal, understanding them made moving forward possible. for everyone involved. The days following the revelation were heavy with reflection for everyone involved, but none more so than Harold Becker. The weight of his grandfather's sins and his own complicity in keeping them hidden seemed to settle visibly on his shoulders. Gone was the cantankerous demeanor that had defined him for years. In its place was a quieter, humbler man grappling with the consequences of truths long buried. Harold arrived at Eleanor's modest home 2 days after the gathering, his hands clutching a worn wooden box. Maggie accompanied him, serving as both witness and support, though she wasn't sure what to expect. Would Eleanor accept his apology, or would decades of bitterness prove too deep to overcome? Eleanor opened the door cautiously, her expression unreadable as she took in the sight of Harold standing on her porch. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with a small nod, she stepped aside to let them in. Inside, the air felt thick with unspoken words. Harold set the box gently on the coffee table, his movements deliberate and hesitant. When he finally looked up at Eleanor, his eyes were filled with remorse. "I don't know where to start," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "except to say, I'm sorry, truly sorry. My grandfather, he was a coward, and I should have said something sooner. But I was afraid of what it would mean for my family, for me." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "When I found those letters, I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore, that dragging it all up again wouldn't change anything. But I see now how wrong I was. What happened to your father, to your whole family? It wasn't fair. None of it." Eleanor listened silently, her gaze steady but softened by the years of pain etched into her face. She didn't interrupt, allowing Harold to speak without interruption, even as tears welled in her eyes. "These belong to you," Harold said, gesturing to the box. "I kept them locked away all these years, thinking they were just old trinkets. But they're not. They're part of your history, part of who you are." With trembling hands, Eleanor opened the lid of the box. Inside were several pieces of jewelry, necklaces, rings, brooches, all unmistakably from the stolen Hargrove collection. Among them lay a delicate pearl bracelet engraved with the initials M.W., her mother's name. For a long moment, Eleanor simply stared at the contents, her fingers hovering over the treasures. Then, with a shaky breath, she reached out and lifted the bracelet, holding it close to her heart. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This means more than I can say." Harold nodded, his own eyes glistening. "It's not enough. Nothing I do will ever be enough to make up for what my grandfather did. But I hope this is a start, a way to begin setting things right." Eleanor met his gaze, her expression softening further. "You didn't commit those crimes, Harold. You're not responsible for your grandfather's actions. But," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "what matters now is that you've chosen to confront them, to bring this truth into the light. That takes courage." Her words seemed to ease some of the tension in Harold's posture. He nodded again, gratitude flickering across his weathered features. "I'll do whatever I can to help. If there's anything else, anything at all, you need from me, just say the word." As the conversation continued, Maggie watched quietly from the corner of the room, marveling at the fragile yet undeniable bond forming between two people bound by shared history. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward healing, toward closure. Before leaving, Harold promised to work with the local historical society to ensure Reginald Becker's role in the scandal was documented accurately. "Let the truth stand as it is," he said firmly. "No sugarcoating, no excuses, just the facts." Eleanor agreed, her voice steady despite the emotions still swirling within her. "History has a way of finding its way back to us," she murmured. "Maybe this time we'll learn from it." Later that evening, as Maggie sat on her porch with Charlie curled up at her feet, she reflected on everything that had transpired. The journey had been unexpected, fraught with twists and revelations that had shaken the very foundations of their small town. Yet through it all, something remarkable had emerged. A chance for redemption, however imperfect, and a reminder that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal when faced with honesty and courage. Charlie barked softly, nudging her hand with his nose. Maggie smiled, scratching behind his ears. "You've done good, boy," she said softly. "Better than I ever imagined." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the woods behind her house in shadow, Maggie felt a profound sense of peace. Secrets might never fully disappear, but neither did the hope that came with uncovering them. That night, after the house had grown quiet and the stars stretched across the sky like scattered diamonds, Maggie found herself sitting alone in the living room. The journal Charles Whitmore had left behind rested on the coffee table, its worn cover a testament to the secrets it had guarded for decades. Beside it lay Arthur's old notebook, its pages filled with his neat handwriting and cryptic musings. Maggie picked up the notebook, running her fingers over the words he'd written so many years ago. "Always remember what lies beneath." For months after his passing, those words had felt like a riddle she couldn't solve, a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. But now, as she sat in the stillness of her home, their meaning finally clicked into place. It wasn't a burden Arthur had intended to leave her. It was a gift. He hadn't kept his discovery about the Whitmore estate and the theft out of fear or guilt. He'd done it because he believed some truths were too painful to confront without preparation. And perhaps, deep down, he'd known that when the time came, she would be ready. Not just to uncover the past, but to find a way forward through it. Her eyes drifted to Charlie, who lay sprawled on the rug nearby, snoring softly. In many ways, he had been the bridge between her grief and this newfound sense of purpose. His quirks, his relentless curiosity, his uncanny ability to lead her exactly where she needed to go. It was as if Arthur had sent him to guide her, to nudge her gently toward healing and justice. Tears welled in Maggie's eyes as she realized how much this journey had changed her. At first, she'd resented the idea of adopting Charlie, seeing it as an intrusion on her solitude, a reminder of the life she'd lost. But now she understood that he had given her something far greater, a reason to keep moving, to keep searching, to keep living. She thought about Eleanor, whose pain had run deeper than anyone could have guessed. Losing her father to accusations he didn't deserve, watching her family crumble under the weight of scandal, Eleanor had carried that grief silently for decades. Yet today, thanks to Harold's confession and the return of the stolen items, she seemed lighter somehow, as though a piece of her soul had been restored. And then there was Harold himself, a man Maggie had always dismissed as gruff and unapproachable. She'd never imagined he might harbor such profound regret, let alone have the courage to face it. Watching him confront the sins of his grandfather, and by extension, his own complicity, had been humbling. It reminded her that everyone carried burdens, visible or not, and that redemption was possible even in the most unlikely places. Maggie closed Arthur's notebook and set it aside, her heart swelling with gratitude. This journey hadn't just uncovered secrets hidden in the woods or revealed long-buried truths about the Whitmore scandal. It had helped her process her own grief, allowing her to see Arthur not as a distant memory frozen in time, but as someone who continued to shape her life in unexpected ways. His note, "Always remember what lies beneath," wasn't a warning to avoid the past. It was an invitation to embrace it, to dig beneath the surface and find the connections that bound them all together. As she leaned back in her chair, listening to the soft rustle of leaves outside and the rhythmic sound of Charlie's breathing, Maggie felt a warmth spread through her chest. Grief would always be part of her story, just as it was part of Eleanor's, Harold's, and countless others in their town. But so was hope. So was healing. For the first time in months, she felt truly alive again. Not in spite of her loss, but because of it. Because Arthur's love hadn't ended with his death. It had lingered, guiding her step by step, until she found her footing once more. Charlie stirred, lifting his head briefly before settling back down with a contented sigh. Maggie smiled, reaching out to stroke his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for everything." And in the quiet of the night, surrounded by the echoes of the past and the promise of tomorrow, Maggie knew she would be okay. In the weeks that followed, the town underwent a quiet transformation. The revelation of Charles Whitmore's innocence and the role Reginald Becker had played in framing him sparked a renewed sense of unity among its residents. What had once been a source of division and shame became an opportunity for healing, as people came together to honor the truth and restore what had been lost. At the heart of this effort was the Whitmore estate itself. For decades, the mansion had stood neglected, its grandeur obscured by ivy and decay. But now, inspired by Eleanor's courage and Harold's contrition, the community rallied to breathe new life into the property. Volunteers poured in from all corners of town, donating time, resources, and expertise to transform the crumbling structure into something extraordinary, a museum dedicated to preserving not only the Whitmore family's legacy, but also the lessons learned from their tragic history. Eleanor, who had spent years avoiding the house where so many painful memories lingered, surprised everyone, including herself, by deciding to move back in. With Maggie's encouragement, she took up residence in the restored East Wing, overseeing the final stages of the renovation with a mix of pride and quiet resolve. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm her, but surrounded by supportive neighbors and buoyed by the knowledge that justice had finally been served, she found solace in reclaiming her family's heritage. Maggie became a frequent visitor to the estate, often bringing Charlie along for company. Together they explored the newly renovated rooms, each one filled with artifacts and photographs that told the story of the Whitmore's rise and fall and eventual redemption. Eleanor greeted them warmly on every visit, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Charlie bounding through the halls like he owned the place. "He's quite the character," Eleanor remarked one afternoon as she watched Charlie chase after a stray moth near the library window. "I think he belongs here almost as much as I do," Maggie laughed, settling into a chair beside her. "He does seem to have a knack for finding trouble, or treasures, depending on how you look at it." The two women shared a smile, their bond strengthened by all they'd been through. Over tea and conversation, they spoke openly about the past, not just the scandal that had shaped their lives, but also the personal losses that had brought them closer together. Eleanor marveled at Maggie's resilience, while Maggie admired Eleanor's grace in facing a lifetime of pain head-on. "You've done something remarkable here," Maggie said one day as they walked through the gardens, which had been lovingly restored to their former glory. "This place feels alive again." "It's because of people like you," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but firm. "People who refused to let the truth stay buried, who reminded us that even the hardest chapters can lead to something beautiful." As autumn settled over the town, painting the trees in fairy hues of red and gold, the Whitmore Museum held its grand opening. Residents young and old gathered on the sprawling front lawn, marveling at the mansion's transformation. Inside, exhibits chronicled the Whitmore family's history, including a special section devoted to Charles Whitmore's exoneration. Arthur's journal sat proudly displayed alongside Charles's, a testament to the enduring power of curiosity, courage, and compassion. Harold attended the event, standing quietly near the back of the crowd. Though his presence still made some uneasy, no one could deny the sincerity of his efforts to make amends. He approached Eleanor afterward, offering a simple yet heartfelt apology once more. To everyone's surprise, Eleanor accepted it with a nod and a small smile, signaling a tentative truce between their families. For Maggie, the resolution of the mystery marked the beginning of a new chapter. She continued to visit Eleanor regularly, cherishing the friendship they'd forged through shared adversity. Charlie remained her constant companion, his antics providing endless amusement, and occasionally a nudge toward another hidden treasure in the woods. But more than anything, Maggie felt at peace. The grief she'd carried since Arthur's death hadn't disappeared, nor had the ache of losing him. Yet within that sorrow, she'd discovered something profound: the ability to carry love forward, to honor those who had shaped her life by embracing the connections that bound her to others. One crisp morning, as she and Charlie strolled through the forest behind her house, Maggie paused at the edge of the clearing where the old shed had once stood. The ruins had been cleared away, replaced by a plaque commemorating the site as the place where long-buried secrets had finally come to light. Charlie barked softly, tugging at her sleeve to keep moving. Maggie smiled, giving him a gentle pat before turning back toward home. "All right, boy," she said, her voice warm with affection. "Let's see what tomorrow brings." And as sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns on the path ahead, Maggie knew she was ready for whatever came next. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Maggie sat on her porch swing, a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the oaks that lined her yard. Beside her, Charlie lay curled up like a furry comma, his head resting on his paws as he dozed contentedly. Every now and then his tail thumped lazily against the wooden planks, as if even in sleep he was attuned to the quiet joy of the moment. Maggie sipped from a mug of chamomile tea, the same one she'd held months ago when this journey began. Back then, the silence had felt heavy, almost suffocating, a reminder of all she'd lost. But now, it was different. The stillness wasn't empty. It was full of memories, of connections, of stories waiting to be uncovered. Her gaze drifted toward the woods behind her house, where shadows stretched long across the forest floor. Charlie's adventures there had become something of a local legend, though no one batted an eye anymore when he trotted home with another trinket clutched proudly in his jaws. These days, the items he unearthed were treated less as mysteries and more as relics, fragments of history eager to share their tales. Some found their way into the Whitmore Museum, while others remained tucked safely away in Eleanor's care, each one adding another thread to the rich tapestry of the town's past. Maggie smiled softly, remembering how far they'd come since those first bewildering days. She'd started this journey reluctant, grieving, unsure if she could ever find meaning again after Arthur's death. But Charlie, with his quirky habits and boundless curiosity, had led her straight to it. He hadn't just helped solve a decades-old mystery, he'd reminded her that life was full of unexpected twists, each one carrying the potential for growth, connection, and healing. Her thoughts turned briefly to Arthur, as they often did during quiet moments like these. She imagined him sitting beside her on the porch, chuckling at Charlie's antics, or marveling at how much the town had changed because of their efforts. She liked to think he'd approve, not just of what she'd accomplished, but of the person she'd become in the process. Stronger, kinder, more open to the beauty of second chances. Charlie stirred, lifting his head briefly to glance at her, before settling back down with a contented sigh. Maggie reached out to scratch behind his ears, her smile widening. "Well, boy," she murmured, her voice tinged with affection, "you've certainly kept things interesting around here." As the last rays of sunlight faded into twilight, casting the world in a gentle lavender glow, Maggie leaned back in the swing, letting its rhythmic sway lull her into a state of peaceful reflection. Life hadn't unfolded the way she'd expected, not by a long shot. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the best moments weren't the ones you planned, but the ones that surprised you, catching you off guard and changing you in ways you never saw coming. She took a deep breath, savoring the cool evening air, and let her eyes close for a moment. When she opened them again, the first stars were beginning to twinkle overhead, tiny pinpricks of light scattered across an endless canvas. Gratitude swelled within her, not just for Charlie or for Eleanor, or for the town that had embraced her so fully, but for everything, for the pain that had taught her resilience, for the secrets that had revealed truths, for the love that lingered, even after loss. And as she sat there, watching the night settle in, Maggie felt a profound sense of peace. Life might not always make sense, but it was beautiful nonetheless, and she was grateful to be part of it. Charlie shifted slightly, nudging her hand with his nose. Maggie laughed softly, giving him a final pat before setting her mug aside. "All right, my clever boy," she said, rising to her feet. "Let's call it a night." As they stepped inside together, the porch light flickered on, casting a warm golden glow over the yard. Somewhere in the distance an owl hooted, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of new adventures yet to come.